Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is James van Kallenburg, and I am the Curatorial Associate with the SS United States Conservancy. Tonight, we're very excited to be hosting Simon Spalding, the wonderful scholar, sailor, musician, and author of Food at Sea, Shipboard Cuisine from Ancient to Modern Times. Tonight's program is all about dining at sea on the SS United States, as well as ships throughout history, how that food is prepared, served, who eats it, and more. This is our second edition of the Allowance List webinar, a series dedicated to sharing the stories behind the many objects in the Conservancy's collections. The name Allowance List comes from a document that the SS United States crew once kept to keep track of all of the objects on the ship. This series invites members to learn from scholars and thinkers connected to the SS United States and look deeper into the history of our beloved ship. To preview our show tonight, I'm going to start off by showcasing some objects from the Conservancy's extensive collections related to dining on the SS United States. Then we'll hear from Simon about his research on dining from the early steamships to ocean liners. Finally, we'll wrap up with a discussion and Q&A session. So feel free to use the Q&A function. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen. Keep those questions coming all night. We'll try to answer as many as we can. I know many of you joining us tonight had the pleasure of tasting the food on the SS United States yourselves. So please share those memories and opinions as we go along. But before that, I would like to thank the folks that made this possible. Thank you to our partners at the Historic Foodways Society of the Delaware Valley for co-sponsoring this event, and welcome to the Society members joining us tonight. The Historic Foodways Society of the Delaware Valley is a nonprofit group dedicated to the promotion and understanding of food history. Their focus includes 17th through 19th century cooking and the rich foodways of the greater Philadelphia region. They sponsor events on a wide range of food topics at historic sites around Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Please consider joining the Society if you also love food history and want to share your passion with others. You can find more information at their website, historicfoodways.org. And thank you to Conservancy members like you. It's only because of your support, your time, donations, and contributions to our archive that our work of preserving the SS United States' legacy has been possible. If you would like to become a member or make a donation, visit our website at ssusc.org/donate. And then finally, thank you to the Conservancy's Board of Directors and Advisory Council, and current and past Conservancy staff, Judith, Judy, and Becky. Full steam ahead, and let's get started. So I'd like to give everybody an introduction to the wonderful archives that the Conservancy has. We've been collecting objects since about 2009. We are very proud to have the largest collection of SS United States artifacts in the world. We have storage sites across the East Coast, and we collect things from art, furniture, documents, objects, photos, videos, ship parts. If it's related to the SS United States, we probably have it. And we are very grateful to receive donations from former passengers, former crew, families of former passengers and former crew, and also collectors. Here on the left, I have a picture of an exhibit that we mounted at the Independent Seaport Museum. We love showing off our collection in physical exhibits like this, also digital exhibits on our website, ssusc.org, and then also at our upcoming land-based museum in Florida. A few dining collections of note. We have the Albert W. Durant collection. It's a great collection of photos taken by the first licensed Black photographer in Virginia. Those are great photos of some of the crew during the sea trials of the SS United States in 1951. We have the Fred Bismarck collection, which I have a highlight from over here. Fred Bismarck is the son of Otto Bismarck. He was the head chef of the SS United States during her entire service career. So you have some great behind the scenes photos from the kitchen, some publicity stuff. The Dr. Sarah E. Forbes collection is very special to us. She really had, I think, the first museum dedicated to the SS United States. Her her restaurant, Windmills Point. Her collection of artifacts and ship parts and art, we're very grateful to take care of now. And the F. Samuel Bauer collection, which is an amazing collection of really nitty-gritty, detailed documents. So, a document that says we need 10 pounds of fish tomorrow. That's the kind of document that's in this collection. And we just absolutely fascinating stuff. So I'm gonna show off some of our dining objects. We have to start with the menus, of course. I just highlighted some giant collections of objects. We have collections that are hundreds of objects that were donated to us, but really the most common donation that we receive is menus, just one or two menus from former passengers who saved them as a memento of their journey. So I have some gala menus from 1953 and 1962. This beautiful artwork here on the front showing off our beloved ship. And then here on the right, we have a working menu. So this is a donation from a family of a former crew member. And this is kind of a behind the scenes look at them determining what to put on the final menu. So this is printed on carbon paper. I believe it's called, that tracing paper. So this is the menu before they decide exactly what's going to be on the menu. There's some interesting food on this. I'll leave the interesting 50s, 60s food discussions to Simon. But fried chicken Maryland is my, I don't know if I would say favorite, but I'm very curious about it. It has banana and bacon. We are honored to be the home of many people's family photos. So I have two examples here. On the left, we have a photo from 1965. It's clearly first class dining room. We have folks dressed to the nines. And we also have a little preview of Gwen Lux's beautiful sculpture, Expressions of Freedom, in the background. We can tell that it's first class by that sculpture in the background and also the size of the table. And here on the right side is a great picture of these kids at a tourist class dining table having what looks like, I think, ice cream with chocolate syrup. And so we can tell that this is tourist class, again, based off of the size of the table and the decor here in the background. Speaking of decor, we have a number of pieces of art and furniture in our collection. Perhaps the crowning jewel, it's a bit honey, is this snowflake artwork that we have from Charles Lynn Tussaud. We were very grateful to acquire this a few years ago, and it is being held now at Gibbs and Cox for safekeeping. This artwork was once in the first class restaurant on the promenade deck. This was a small a la carte restaurant where only about 50 people could fit. And then we have tons of chairs. I could not possibly include enough photos of all of the chairs that we have, but here's one example. We're very excited to have, these big, beautiful artworks like Tussaud's snowflake montage, but then also, these little details, right? These chairs. This is really what's going to help bring the SS United States alive in our museum and really transport people back to what it was like to dine on board. Of course, we have a lot of Chinaware, as you can imagine. They were serving about 9,000 meals per day on the SS United States. So if you do the math, imagine a very elaborate table setting. That's a lot of plates. That's a lot of cups. It's a lot of serveware. And we are very grateful to have quite a lot in our collection. Here on the left is an interesting plate. This is called a service plate. This was not actually a plate that was eaten off of, but it was for display. So it has this beautiful gold rim here. And here on the right, we also have a very typical plate and cup, which are decorated with the gray star pattern. This personally is one of my favorite collections of objects that we have, and this is a collection of sea pottery. So if you're familiar with sea glass, it's the same idea. These are pieces of pottery that have been trapped in sea currents for, in this case, perhaps maybe 50 years. And so they get slowly worn down by the sea. And these are shards of plates from the SS United States. They were collected by Stephanie May between 2001 to 2017, which is just amazing to think that she was collecting these for 16 years. And this is just, these pictures are just scratching the surface. We have a lot more of these shards. But I love that you can see this barnacle growth on it, and just, yeah, it's very stunning. We can tell that these are from the SS United States because of the gray star pattern, as I mentioned earlier, but also this maker's mark that's on the bottom, Mayer China, which made the serveware expressly for the United States lines. The best guess that we have as to why these shards ended up in the sea is that they were likely broken plates that were thrown overboard. So these were found by Stephanie May on the beaches across from the Southampton port. So our thought is that when the SS United States came into port, some crew members had the maybe fun task, I don't know, sounds kind of fun, of taking the broken plates and just throwing them overboard because that's one way to get get rid of them. But such an interesting, yeah, just a fascinating, I think, group of objects that we take care of. And then finally, we have an amazing collection of objects and photos related to the crew that worked on the SS United States. These are the people that made the food. They made the SS United States experience possible. Here on the right, this is a photo from the collection that I was mentioning earlier, Albert W. Durant. These photos were taken during the sea trials, and his focus was particularly on the Black crew members that were on board. And they're great photos because they show the insides of the kitchen. This is not something that, maybe a lot of passengers got to see, but yeah, just, and look how futuristic it looks. The stainless steel, very clean, and very efficient, efficient kitchen run by Otto Bismarck. And then here on the left is a really interesting, it's a very small piece of paper. The size on the presentation doesn't really do it justice, but it is also a piece of carbon paper, and it's a work slip. So if you maybe have had experience working on a ship through the National Maritime Union, maybe you've seen a version of this before, but this is the slip that was given to a gentleman, Robert, who was assigned mess steward on board. And so this is just, it's a small piece of paper, but it tells a big story. And it tells the story of how folks would go to the union halls and they would get assigned certain jobs. And yeah, I think put together all of these objects, they tell a very wide and varied story of the SS United States, and we're very excited to share it. So, all right, that was my little sneak peek. I know that was just it was very brief, but stay tuned and you will learn more and see more in our upcoming dining exhibit. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Simon after I give him a brief little introduction. Simon Spalding is a maritime historian, as well as a writer, lecturer, teacher, and performer. He's created educational programs for museums throughout the United States and in Europe. He's performed and lectured in festivals, concerts, and museums throughout North America and 12 European countries, and served as a crew member aboard several traditional sailing vessels. His previous writings include articles on history and education, museum manuals, and the script, The Constitutional Convention of 1836 for the Texas Historical Commission. You can see more about him at musicalhistorian.com. And thank you to Rowman and Littlefield Publishers for that bio. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yeah, I will turn it over to Simon. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for the wonderful introduction and the invitation to talk to all of you. I'll start off by saying a few words about how I came to write the book and about the total scope of the book, and then I promise I'll get down to the nuts and bolts of food service on steamships and ocean liners, leading up to and including the working life of SS United States. I came to write the book in a curious fashion. Roman and Littlefield was planning a series of books called Food on the Move, about food served in situations where people are not in one place, but are moving. And it was the author of the Food and Air and Space volume, Richard Foss, who told me about the series and suggested I put my name in the hat for for Food at Sea. And I'm pleased they chose me, because I know that there were a few other applicants as well. And I had never written a full length book before. I'd done a lot of writing, including writing a play script for an historic site, and but I hadn't written a full length book until this one, and but they took a chance on me and got the contract. I should say about the book Food at Sea that it is the first book to cover the subject of food at sea, how food is preserved, prepared, and consumed for all of human history. It is also likely to be the last book to cover that subject for all of human history. There are other books with a little bit more of a specific geographic or temporal focus, and but I tried to cover nearly everything, and of course I wasn't able to cover absolutely everything, but I gave it a good try. And there were, in approaching the book, there were certain aspects of the subject that I already had. If I didn't have my research done, I knew where my sources were. There were books that I'd read that I knew that I could reread with an eye on food service. So some of the chapters almost wrote themselves. The one on 19th century merchant ships, for example, I had a lot of the research either done, or I knew I already had the books in my library that I was going to consult to get a more detailed picture of the food. I There were others where I was starting practically from scratch. Cruise ships, for example. I've never been on a cruise. I've done a good deal of offshore and inshore sailing, but I've never been on one on a cruise. A giant floating hotel with 1,000 or more people on board. So I just had to find good sources. Most of my research, I'll start off with a couple of admissions. One of them is that most of my research was secondary. There's some primary research in my book, mostly covering food issues in the Union Navy during the Civil War. There again, I had a source in my library that I knew I could turn to, and I had never analyzed it in terms of looking for patterns in food issues aboard USS Hartford during the spring and summer of 1864. But I knew that I had a transcript of a journal that was kept by a Marine on board, in which he, on most days, mentions what the main thing was they had there. So I did some primary research there, but a lot of my research is secondary. So I owe a great debt of gratitude for 20th century ocean liner food issues to John Maxtone Graham, who wrote a wonderful book called The Only Way to Cross. And if you're interested in a more in-depth view of food on ocean liners in the 20th century, than I offered in my book, you can go to his book and get a lot more detail. And it's like that for several of the chapters. Janet McDonald for naval issues of food in the 17th and 18th and early 19th centuries. She wrote a wonderful book called Feeding Nelson's Navy, which is, yes, it's Anglo-centric, but it also includes very interesting information about the Dutch Navy, the French Navy, and the American Navy as well. Um, so I do owe a great debt of gratitude to John Maxtone Graham, who I've never met, but who produced a wonderful book called The Only Way to Cross. Um, Much of my information on ocean liner food comes from there. But let me start the story, and I'm not going to start the story in the Middle Stone Age where the book begins, but we'll fast forward up to, let's say, the 1840s. And that is when Cunard begins transatlantic steamer service across the Atlantic. And fortunately, we have famous author, took a trip in I think it was 1847 on board Britannia, one of Cunard's earliest transatlantic steamers. Charles Dickens wrote in some detail about that passage in his book American Notes for General Circulation, and he came back incidentally on a sailing kit that mostly was in the immigrant trade, and so there's some valuable information on his return trip back to Britain there. But at the time Dickens took his trip on Britannia, steam engines were inefficient, and so Britannia left the old world just absolutely chock full of coal to make this trip, and then arrived in Halifax, and then went on to Boston. By the time she got to Halifax, Britannia would have been floating light because most of this coal had been consumed, and because of the really high coal consumption of mid 19th century steamers, the it was a luxury. In the book, I compare traveling on Britannia as Dickens did in the 1840s to the experience of people flying on the Concorde in the 1970s. It's fast, it's expensive, um, and something of a prestige sort of item. And so the Dickens wrote a little bit, rather sparsely, about the food on board. If you're interested in an earlier period, there's some that can be a little surprising to us. For example, that they carried a cow on board in a special padded cell, and that was so they could have fresh cream for their tea on board. And that was not as unusual one might think. There were less expensive, less exotic vessels in transoceanic service that also carried a cow on board. Sometimes they didn't have a padded stall like the Cunard steamers did, and they just let the cow sort of take as its stall one of the boats. And I know with one vessel that sank catastrophically, the main boat that should have been what the passengers could make their escape on, from having the cow pooping in it for that voyage and maybe others without it being cleaned out. The garboard stakes had rotted out, and the boat was unusable. But that's another rabbit hole. So anyhow, in the mid 19th century, it was not for passenger vessels to even carry a cow on board. Food service was extremely Spartan in immigrant ships. I go into that in some detail in one chapter of the book, talking about how the Irish immigrants of the mid 19th century were left to prepare the food themselves in a cast iron stove lashed onto the main hatch. They were only allowed to cook food at certain hours, and came without food when they arrived. What was available were bags and bags of cornmeal, yellow meal, as it's referred to in songs and literature of the period. And one of the great ahas I had in writing the book was that these Irish immigrants eating nothing but corn mush for a trip that often could take a month or more, were probably suffering from early symptoms of a dietary disease known as pellagra by the time they arrived in the New World. And as far as I know, I'm the first one to discover that. And unfortunately, I discovered it about a week or two after I'd sent the book off to the production editor. So you won't read about it in the book. You will read a lot about the terrible situation with food there. But the great aha of pellagra, the early symptoms of which are depression, anxiety, irritability, and skin rashes, all of which would not have been thought unusual for people who'd been on a crowded vessel for over a month. So moving forward to with steamers, a big innovation that affected food service is the development of the triple expansion engine. And in the 1870s, this made steamers far more efficient. So they were making much better use of the coal they were carrying, and this this revolutionized the idea of food service to to the people who were immigrants who previously had been traveling mostly in sailing vessels where there was very little provision made for feeding them. In steamers from the 1880s onwards, you have multi-class service. This is starting to sound familiar, and the shipping company is to responsibility for feeding everybody for the entire voyage. In fact, some of the German lines in the late 19th century started establishing housing ashore for passengers who had booked passage with that line, but were waiting for their ship to depart, and for a modest fee, they had a place to, simple accommodation, places to stay, and meals. So, in the case of some of the German lines, the providing for the food, providing food for their for passengers even started before the ship left the dock. Um, so this moves into the 20th century with the development of the triple engine. This is when ships really fall out of the passenger trade. And as a youth interested in maritime and naval history, I remember reading books that talked about how those horrible, unsentimental immigrants were choosing to go in steamers instead of sailing ships, and wouldn't have been nicer if they gone on the sailing ships. Well, I don't think they wanted to starve on the way, particularly, and that was a very real danger with these sailing vessels. And it wasn't a technical limitation at all, because the sailing navies of the early and mid 19th century had large galleys capable of providing food for everybody on board. And it's just one of the great tragedies of history that people operating transatlantic passenger service didn't really take on that responsibility of cooking for everybody until really it pretty much coincides with the development of the triple expansion engine, and with steamers becoming more efficient. And at that point, they've got multi-class service, and everyone is getting fed. This is the situation as we get into the early 20th century, the really classic era of ocean liners, where in which particularly German and British lines are competing with each other. Some of the British ships are, I'm sorry, some of the German ships were built in Britain. Um, and there's a number of very interesting developments in food service, which I'd like to go into. Let me talk a little bit about early 20th century, where we're now setting the stage for the United States lines and SS United States. By the early 20th century, the ships are bigger. There's a further development in engine design. Turbines. Mauritania and Lusitania had 4 turbine engines, each one driving its own screw. The Olympic and Titanic and Britannic had a mix. They had a turbine running the central screw, and then reciprocating engines, multiple expansion ones, of course, driving the port and starboard screws. So you get a mix, but engines are continuing to get better, which means that the transit time is getting shorter. And the engines are providing more power for their fuel consumption. That fuel being coal up until the First World War, and then largely replaced by oil pretty rapidly after the First World War. And a lot of existing steamers that were coal fired switched to oil firing very soon after the First World War. Um, the the shippers competing with each other for luxury and food service is something that got a big impetus for a man named Albert Ballin, who was in charge of food service and passenger service in general on Hapag, the Hamburg America line. And he did a lot to challenge their British competitors to keep up with the level of luxury being provided in first class, and it's to some degree in second class as well, by the German shipping lines. And so at that point, the typical arrangement for an ocean line, take a vessel like the Mauritania, the Lusitania, Olympic, or Titanic. We'll leave out the Britannic because she was put into service as a hospital ship as soon as she was launched. Um, Very typically, you had two galleys, large galleys, and one galley devoted entirely to preparing food for the third class passengers. By 1900, they weren't usually calling them steerage anymore. How what their sleeping arrangements were kind of varied. Some of the continental carriers still put them in these big sort of dormitory style hallways with bunk beds. Some lines, like such as White Star Line, provided third class cabins that were more like a second class cabin, just a little bit smaller, with maybe four beds if they were single passengers. And so two galleys. So, for example, in Cunard and White Star liners of the early 20th century, the first class and second class food was prepared in the same galley. And that was a convenient arrangement if substitutions had to be made. If we've run out of asparagus for the first class passengers, we can substitute string beans and maybe put some slivered almonds or something on them to fancy them up a little bit as a substitution for the first class. It's very easy to make substitutions back and forth between first and second class. And in fact, one of the things that I did in researching the book was to compare the food cards, which shipping lines published before for passengers to peruse when they're considering which shipping line they might want to go um, with actual menus that survive. And I really didn't want to fixate on the Titanic as much as many people do, but I was sort of stuck with this because a lot of the available scholarship, for example, um, menus were either carried by passengers who survived or were found on the bodies of passengers who didn't, and so it allows a very detailed study of what the shipping line promised and what they delivered, and also seeing, for example, where you can see similar food choices in first and second class. In one case with the soups, where there was something different, there was something more expensive floating in the soup in first class, but the soup itself was the same in first and second class. Third class is entirely different. And let me talk a little bit about what the nature of those food choices were, because I think they're culturally very interesting. Um, the food cards for third class, which were printed in the case of White Star, were printed ahead of time. People could peruse them to see what they could expect to have on a trip on a White Star liner. In third class, the choices very much reflect Scandinavian and German preferences. Something I did discover that I thought was rather illuminating was that White Star Line in 1911, 1912 offered kosher meat selections if requested in third class. Interesting note. And their meal cards, some of the information on the meal cards was in English, German, Finnish, and Swedish. So those seem to reflect there were a lot of there were still plenty of Irish immigrants, but they could be expected to read English. Um, but German, Swedish, and Finnish are three languages that they felt needed to be represented in meal information for third class. The tables were of course bolted to the deck. Um, any decoration in the dining halls, and there would have been multiple seatings, and decoration was mostly publicity for the shipping line. Moving up to second class, the tables get a little smaller. They may have um, better views out of portholes. Um, and the food choices tend to reflect middle class preferences in Great Britain and the United States. it was interesting to look at some of the second class food offerings, and you can almost see there's lamb in a sort of British style, but there's also turkey with cranberry sauce. Um, a lot of these balances, all working all the way down the menus, from the soup courses to the dessert courses. You can see in second class both British and American choices, so that middle class tradesmen, businessmen, um, people who are probably making a working trip for some reason across the Atlantic, can order food that's somewhat familiar to them, whether they're British or American. Now you get into first class, which is what other authors tend to really focus on, and you definitely see French cuisine there. A lot of the menu choices um, are from French cooking traditions and identified by their French names, and and of course there's sumptuous, more choices, more luxurious choices. This is It's interesting to me because at this time, in the 19th and early 20th century, the shipping lines actually made more profit off carrying third class passengers than first and second combined. They're more numerous, but it's actually a greater part of their profit is made with the third class passengers. One can see why lines such as White Star Lines took such pains to make sure people, if they didn't read English, if they read Swedish or Finnish in third class, they could know what was on the menu, what the choices were. Um, Offering kosher meat example for passengers who would choose those. Third class passengers actually comprised a greater share of the profits the liners made. The other thing they made profit from, and this was steady money they could count on from voyage to voyage, was carrying mail, which is why the British passenger steamers, the ones with lines that had mail contracts with the British government, have the initials RMS. That's Royal Mail Steamer. They had a mail contract. P&O Lines got Royal Mail contracts to take mail to Egypt and then on India and Australia and New Zealand, and those and the third class passengers actually made more money for the shipping lines than the first and second class did, interestingly enough. Um, then a feature that was, I think, it was a brainchild of Albert Ballin, who worked for the Hamburg America line. I think it was on the liner America that first there was offered an a la carte restaurant. And in the book, I explore a little bit of the history of the a la carte restaurant and how in the United States it starts with the Delmonico brothers from Switzerland, and they open a pastry and restaurant. And the concept here is maybe useful to consider that in a hotel in those days, the hotel kitchen would prepare maybe a couple of entrees, maybe three different sides, and maybe one or two choices for dessert. And so diners were just choosing between a limited selection of what they had already prepared. And the whole concept of the restaurant français, as pioneered in North America by the Delmonico brothers, was that all of the ingredients for everything on the menu are already ready to be cooked at a moment's notice, and the diner can make the selection, and the food is cooked to order right then. And that's a the a la carte restaurant is was initially a German innovation, very quickly introduced on British flag carriers as well. And I was able to peruse the image of one of the a la carte restaurant menus from the White Star line, and it was interesting. It was completely in French. So as you move up in the classes in an early 20th century steamer, at the one level you have English and also German, Swedish, and Finnish. You move up to second class, it's all in English. You're looking at sort of normal food for middle class British and American passengers. Get up into first class, we're getting more into the haute cuisine of France. And then when you get to the a la carte restaurant, you're evidently expected to order everything in French because the menu is completely in French. So that is the situation prior to the First World War. After the First World War, how are we doing time? Not too bad. After the First World War, the coal-fired liners are converted to oil. There's also a new interest in third-class tickets. They start calling it tourist class or tourist slash third class because of students, artists, Americans who just want to explore Europe, but maybe you want to do it on a bicycle with a backpack or something like that. Starting in the 20s, start buying those tickets as well. And then comes the Second World War. And at the end of the Second World War, it's really the American economy that is left most intact. Some of the British um, um, some of the British ships are kind of superannuated. The British economy is, in a pretty grim depression and remains that way. Rationing continues on past the war. We don't even need to mention what happened to a lot of the German shipping. And so, really, we get into the golden age of American passenger service after the Second World War. And you have companies that have freighters can carry 12, in some cases more, but most typically 12 passengers, and they're going to places. There's an interesting little detail. There's a section in my book about the Merchanting Act of 1920, sometimes called the Jones Act, that established laws of cabotage that non-U.S. carriers couldn't carry passengers between two American ports unless they also stopped in a non-American port. And one thing that did is that gave Matson Line a virtual monopoly on traveling from California to Hawaii and back because there were no non-U.S. Islands conveniently located anywhere along the way. That also had to do with the development of the cruise ship industry, which I write about in some detail. The ship is it some of the traditions of the cruise ship industry post World War II started before World War II during the era of Prohibition, where foreign flag carriers, they were the only ones who could serve alcohol on board, would offer trips from one American port to another, but they had to stop on an island or maybe some little fishing village in Nova Scotia on the way. And some of these non-U.S. ports were rather lacking in charm and interest, but as long as the passengers could drink lots of alcohol on the way there and back, they didn't mind. That's another rabbit hole that I won't go down. So with the United States, I think it's particularly interesting to see how, with American leadership in carrying passengers on oceanic trips, that the food choices still have the European influence, but are popular American choices. And in the book, I actually bought on eBay a gala menu from November 1954 from the United States, and it's interesting to see. Like your starters, you've got fresh fruit in Kirschwasser. Beluga caviar. Everyone likes caviar if they're familiar with it. Crab meat cocktail. No one did not like that. Pâté de foie gras in aspic, which they've shortened to foie gras. We get into soups. We've got veloute Bismarck, and maybe it's Otto Bismarck's own recipe. Kangaroo tail soup, and then the fish choices for entree are lobster à l'United States in cassoulet with fleuron, or papillette de Dover sole, bon fin, basically fillet of sole. The meat options, partridge à l'anglaise, so a British style partridge. We got red sauce, wild rice, glaced marron, that's chestnuts, currant jelly, Benedictine sherbet. One thing I thought was kind of interesting, I'm guessing that Bismarck did not draw up the form of the menu that was given to the passengers because there's an interesting little bit of that, a little left over that French pretension. One of the sides are green peas, and they're called, they should be petit pois, but in this menu they're petit bois, little wood. But they sure, it could be a typo, or it could be maybe somebody typing up a menu who hadn't taken French in high school. I don't know. And it goes on. This again, I should say, this is a gala menu, so it's the big blowout dinner before changing the clocks. Some of you have been passengers of, you could say it's the gala night. Is it usually the last night at sea or something like that? I'm kind of guessing that it might be. Interestingly enough, with the drinks, what I've read is in that era, cocktails, which are before dinner, were generally whiskey based, or martinis, which were of course popular in the 50s and 60s. Not so many of what bartenders call umbrella drinks, drinks based on tequila or rum. I think those maybe come into their heyday at sea during the era of cruise ships, which is something again in the book I write about. But I think to say just offer a few opinions of my own. I think the United States is the vessel is a wonderful example of the real zenith of American leadership in passenger service. Which, of course, there was European competition. There was France, and of course the QE2. Wonderful vessels with wonderful service. But I think United States, not only was she the fastest, arguably one of the most beautiful and sleek vessels of her type, and it really, I think, represents final that final stage of luxurious transatlantic travel by sea. By starting in the late 50s, increasingly in the 60s, jet setters want to go to Europe on a 707 or a DC-8, and this becomes, the the travel by ship becomes a little more stodgy until it gets sort of revolutionized by the cruise ship industry, where the voyage itself is the destination. It's not just getting there in comfort, but experiencing being at sea. And so as such, I think she's a real treasure. She is represents a zenith of American passenger service in the history of food at sea.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Simon. Let's do a digital round of applause. It's a pleasure to have you, to be able to speak with you. I can't recommend Simon's book enough. I learned a lot. And I hope that, yes, there you go, the prop. I really recommend. It's such a great overview of the larger context, and it really gave me a better idea of why, as you were just saying, the SS United States is so significant, what made her unique. And yeah, so I encourage folks to keep the questions coming through the Q&A function, but since I'm moderating, I get to ask Simon some of my questions, which is very exciting, because there were a lot of things that stood out to me in the book. So where to start? I think I want to pick up on the fact that you mentioned earlier, really the history of immigrants, transatlantic journeys, and the changing way that immigrants ate food on ships. I think that you do a really good job of showing, yeah, just how dramatic that shift is. Just the image, yeah, of making food for yourself on a ship that you paid passage for. You have to prepare your own food. So the SS United States has the distinction of having brought thousands of immigrants to America during her service career, and our oral history collections include a lot of stories of folks trying American food for the first time. I know we have one story written by someone who said that they were stunned at eating corn on the cob. When corn on the cob showed up on the dining table, they thought it was so funny because in Germany that's what they fed their pigs, which
Yeah.
I think is such a funny story. And as you were saying, there was a lot of American food on the SSUS, but then there was also a lot of international food. So I'm wondering what you think the significance is of serving that American food at the same time as that international cuisine. And yeah, I guess what message do you think that was sending primarily the immigrants that were coming on board, but also the other Americans that were on board? Yeah.
Well, I think that that it's continuing that tradition that you can see in Cunard and White Star Line service, for example, in the earlier era, um, where they're trying to make most of the menu choices appropriate for the majority of passengers in that class. So
Mm-hmm.
what's maybe different about the experience of passengers, say in 1910, is that at that time on the ship, looking at the menu choices, they were getting pretty much Irish, British, and Scandinavian menu choices in third class. But in second class, it's mostly British and American ones. And I think perhaps by the 50s, that I just my opinion would be that maybe they're treating all classes of passengers a little more like they treated their second class passengers in the early
Mm-hmm.
20th century. That, here's, you can try something familiar or you can try something new. You might be British, you might go, I had lamb a week ago, turkey with cranberry sauce. Never
Mm-hmm.
had that before. Give it a go. And maybe I'll order something more familiar for my wife, and then if I don't like mine, maybe I
Mm,
can
all
I
right.
can yes, something like that. So I think that's what's going on there. And of course, having a German cook, he's aware of European foodways, but at least looking at that gala menu, there are some luxury European items, but alongside each of them, there are things that Americans will be familiar with.
Mhm. Yeah, that's an interesting balance, the familiar and also the new. I think that the SS United States did really harness that in a lot of the food, but then also the decor and artwork. Yeah, I mean, this is when American identity as we know it is kind of being created post World War II. And so it's, yeah, introducing the larger world to that identity and then also, encouraging the Americans that are on board. Interesting. Um,
Yeah.
this question is a little out of left field, but something that comes up in my research of the SS United States is dress codes. And so in passenger list booklets, there were specific suggestions, maybe you could say, or encouragements of people to wear certain formal dress, especially when dining. And I'm curious if there is an equivalent for that in other dining scenarios on ships. Yeah, I'm wondering how unique that was. Of course, in the 50s and 60s, our idea of formal dress was different. People did dress up more often. But I'm just
Absolutely.
curious if that came up.
I think part of it is a reflection of the times because you see
Mhm,
pictures of people taking commercial air air flights in the 1950s, and the men are wearing jackets and ties, and I think so. I think some of it reflects cultural norms of that time, and I can speak to this kind of sideways by saying that when the cruise ship, the origins of cruise ships go way, way, way back, where there are trips to the Mediterranean in for example, in the 20s and 30s. Now, here's an interesting contrast I'll give you about dress codes, not for dining, but just for appearing on deck, was
Okay.
20s and 30s. Some of the German shippers would show elegant passengers dressed in business attire on deck. But Italian carriers, and there were some really wonderful Italian passenger liners in the period between the World War, would show families at the pool throwing a beach ball around.
Oh,
And
interesting.
yeah, and so there's some interesting cultural differences even within European tradition, the different European liners about how they want their potential passengers to see themselves on this trip. That the Germans are still a little more formal, the Italians are already less formal. I can certainly say this all becomes much less formal with the real blossoming of the cruise ship industry, where I think it's much more, show up, dress as you are.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that was something that Ted Arison deliberately, he was already in the cruise ship business, but when he started Carnival Lines, these are the fun boats. You come out here, bring your swimsuit. You want to
Mm.
come have your swimsuit and a wet t-shirt? Go ahead.
Mhm.
You're here to have fun. Whereas I think the United States lines and the United States, the vessel, are still continuing a tradition that went back a long, long ways. Not only in how people dressed for meals at sea, but how people dressed for meals generally in a hotel, for example.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving the cultural context and then also that this is a lot of a lot of the culture on ocean liners was really connected to hotels at the time. They really informed each other. Um, Yeah, interesting. I will say we have some interesting stories of people breaking the dress code, because that's very memorable. So folks will share those stories of people showing up in the first class dining room just wearing, I think one was like it was a poncho and everybody was staring, because this is the mid 1950s and people are like, what on earth is that woman doing? Um,
Oh,
yeah, interesting.
yeah, but it's
It's
the mid
yeah.
1950s. My parents were in some ways could be considered bohemian beatniks in San Francisco in the mid 50s. I know that some of my mother's clothing choices might have shocked people on a liner, although the quality of what she wore was always very good. But like other people who were involved in the arts in the mid 1950s, they're breaking out of those sartorial norms.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, exactly. The 50s and 60s is such an inflection point for fashion and also cuisine. And
Yes.
how global everything is becoming. People are taking influences from around the world. And I think that you can also there's quite a difference from passengers' photos and the fashion in the early 1950s to the end of the SS United States service career, and the models that are being used in advertisements. It is much more that kind of relaxing vacation that you're talking about, as opposed to maybe the luxury business attire. Um,
Mhm.
I see a comment here from someone who sailed 11 voyages in first class and can vouch for the wonderful dining experience, which is, yeah, amazing.
Yeah, yeah, that's what a treat. Let me offer something I thought was interesting was that you were saying there was an a la carte restaurant on the
Mhm.
United States, and I find that interesting. That is a very interesting holdover from an earlier era when the Hamburg America steamer America first offered the an a la carte restaurant. That was the creme de la creme. That was the absolute ultimate in luxury
Right.
to dine there. And I think what is interesting is here's an example. One of their liners, Imperator, was a war prize to Britain and was
Mhm.
renamed Bering Area and handed over to Cunard Lines. And in the 30s, on board the Bering Area, the a la carte restaurant was stripped out and replaced with a ballroom.
Oh, wow. So no more
So,
luggage, no more exclusivity. We're all going to dance now.
right, or at least there's more people who want to dance
Right.
than
Hmm.
want to eat in this ultra luxurious context. So it's kind of interesting to see that the United States did have an a la carte restaurant.
Hmm.
Uh, Assuming if it was offering food more luxurious than in first class, then it would be following an older tradition which had already started to fade away, at least in British service in the 1930s. Interesting. Maybe, maybe a little bit of a throwback to that. On the other hand, if it's more like a grill where you can get a hamburger just done quickly, well, then it's, then it's maybe a little bit more forward thinking. I'd be curious if I'd be curious to know from people who traveled on board what was the a la carte restaurant like? Is
Hmm.
it like a grill,
Hmm.
or is it like where you can get things that have to go straight from the pan to your plate to be enjoyed at their best, that are even more expensive than the first class options. So I'm coming away with questions of my own
Right.
now.
Yeah, I think, yeah,
Uh,
the SS United States really did have a very wide array, yeah, of options of luxury and exclusivity. Because yeah, sometimes buffet style and then sitting down at, because we have photos of folks going down a buffet line or yeah, being in this ultra exclusive lounge. It's interesting that those things can be happening at the same time, that there can be kind of a democratic, lots of folks from different classes interacting, but then there is still that luxury option. This is kind of a big question, but the comment from James Rose, who sailed 11 voyages and can vouch for the wonderful dining experience, made me think, why I guess the thing that always comes up when we speak with former passengers and crew is always memories of dining. And I'm wondering why you think that is. I guess out of everything that folks can remember on their transatlantic crossing, and there were lots of things to do on the ship, and there were lots of people to see, but I find it almost always comes back to dining. What do you think? I don't know if that's something about humans or about the seafaring experience. Why is yeah, dining on board such an important part of it?
well, again, someone who took 11 trips in the United States might have more of a, more of a grip on what that's like for a passenger. I can say for myself, I went on a transatlantic trip on a Polish sail training vessel, and I have lots of really vivid memories, but some most vivid memories are also dining.
Hmm.
And part of that is just the sheer pleasure of being on deck in heavy weather for 4 hours and then coming down below, in my case, pulling off my survival suit. And here I am, and my clothes that are still mostly dry inside, or if my t-shirt got wet through the collar opening, then I replaced it with a dry one, and then sitting down with my watchmates um, to have a nice hot meal. And some of my memories are really most vivid memories of my transatlantic trip on Zawisza are also of dining. For example, I can remember in really heavy weather where we put the fiddle up on the tables, so you've got little, we've got them on the cover. You can see them here from the 1890s, a P&O liner with these little baffles you put on the tables. I don't know if they did that in the United States, but um, the and I remember this, you said the fiddle, it was neat. I thought, oh yeah, I've seen these, on 19th century sailing ships that are museum ships. And I remember that eating soup, for example, you had to keep a hand on your soup bowl and you had to fill the bowl only halfway up because
Mm.
oh,
Absolutely.
washing away. You wanted to have more of it in your mouth than on your clothes, and it made, it was just this kind of funny thing. We laugh about it. So I can certainly say for when you're a working sailor, especially in like sailing vessels as opposed to power ones, where the interior spaces are smaller, more cramped. Um, there's a lot to be said for those. Schooner Pioneer, both Captain Eric Rice and myself both were breakfast cooks. His specialty was blueberry pancakes. My specialty was omelets. And so we let people decide. We had, you know, crew of maybe about six. This is a small two-masted schooner on coasting trips, and certain, you know, for a cook too, there's all the preparation involved. On Pioneer, for example, when we were unless we were at the dock with shore power, we did all of our cooking on a wood burning stove. On Brig Niagara, also it was a wood burning stove. So there's a lot for the cook and a cook's assistant. Um, and the cook's assistant job is usually rotated among the crew. There's all this preparation long before people get to eat their food. You're having to start the fire, get the fire down to embers, get it at the right heat, and all of that. So I think dining is an important part um, of the seafaring experience. And anytime that you're getting hot food as opposed to having to eat, you know, cold sandwiches or something like that. I remember in the reading about in the campaign against Bismarck and Prince Eugen. Um, of course, the hood was blown up. We don't have many stories about from anybody in the hood. There were only three survivors. But I remember reading about some of the other vessels, King George V, for example, that at one point the seas were so heavy that they couldn't really prepare hot food. And so the men were just getting sandwiches on watch. Well, I bet the first hot meal they got would stick
Mm.
in their memory.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I feel like you're speaking both to the camaraderie of being, I think that crew certainly feels that camaraderie working together. But then also, I have read a lot of testaments to passengers feeling a camaraderie. You know, they don't know each other when they come on board, but they're all experiencing something together and then they get to eat together. And I think that that is memorable. But then you're also speaking to the just like the comfort of it, right? It's cold. And so eating something warm is, yeah, is nourishing and yeah, it's comforting. And it
Yeah.
certainly was cold crossing the transatlantic journey. Yeah, interesting. I see
Yeah. Yeah.
someone shared based off of the SSUS operational guide that they read that the a la carte restaurant had the same food, but it was personalized service. Which I think makes sense from what I understand of the folks that were inside of that restaurant. We're talking about folks like the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Salvador Dali, and so on, and really getting the extra touch of hospitality from United States Lines to make sure that they were repeat passengers.
Right. So it's not just like a hamburger grill. It really is in the old transatlantic tradition, like, you know, the ultimate in personal attention. Your
Mhm,
food, what you want, nothing that you don't want, you know, prepared to order, so it's hot from the pan or the pot as it gets to your plate. Well, that is interesting. And in terms of the larger picture of transatlantic passenger service, that's a rather old-fashioned thing.
mm.
Again, when Imperator became Berengaria, they they took out the a la carte restaurant and replaced it with a ballroom. Now, a ballroom is also, I mean, you probably wouldn't be wearing a poncho to dance in the
Right.
ball either. Uh, but it's interesting to see the priorities, and in a way that's a little bit more of an old fashioned idea
Mhm,
that, but it is interesting that the food was the same, that the food in on board the Olympic and the Titanic, the food was definitely different. It was things that you could not get even
mhm,
off the very luxurious first class menu. But if you just had to have moule marinière or something like that, you could probably get it at the a la carte restaurant.
mhm. Interesting. This I've certainly learned a lot from this conversation about, yeah, the idea of, yeah, the a la carte restaurant, yeah, kind of being a holdover. We don't think about the SS United States often as being old fashioned. In every other way, you know, it was such a groundbreaking experience. But there are still traces that connect her to, yeah, other ocean liners. We have
Absolutely.
just Probably time for one more question, and I really want to ask about alcohol. I learned a lot from your book about the changing attitudes about alcohol on ships. So you mentioned prohibition, but I also learned from your book about the outlawing of grog in the 1860s. And I'm curious.
Enlisted personnel, yeah.
Yes, I'm curious to ask, I guess why you think the attitudes about alcohol have changed so much because alcohol was widely available on the SS United States, but very strictly forbidden for crew. And so we have a number of disciplinary records showing crew members being dismissed because they were even caught with alcohol, not even drinking it, though there were many crew members who were caught drinking to excess as well. I guess, yeah, I'm curious to know what you think about why attitudes about alcohol, I guess, generally changed, but then it seems like there's such a close relationship between alcohol and seafaring. They seem to always be connected in some way. So yeah, curious what you think about that.
Well, I think these changes reflect larger societal changes.
Mhm.
And by 1862, there's a thriving temperance movement. And there's also a perception that alcohol is something that enslaves the working classes.
Mm.
So there's a lot of sort of benign or at least beneficent effort on the middle classes to make to restrict access to alcohol for the working classes because working class people are spending their money on alcohol and not on feeding their children or whatever else. And it's worth bearing in mind, by the way, I've been in a number of discussions with other historians about the role of alcohol in the temperance movement and its history. And I think um, uh, I think that there's a lot of it is sort of the middle class wanting to uh, restrict the enslavement of the working class through manipulation by alcohol, and I think that is a big movement um, behind the temperance movement leading prohibition, and we see what a disaster that was.
Mhm.
It's created a black market for alcohol, deprived the government of the taxation income from legally acquired alcohol, and produced a criminal class that even the rum runners, the McCoy, the real McCoy comes from a rum runner who was running mostly good quality booze in Canada, and he went to jail. He came to jail, was going to go back into the business, and by that time, organized crime. They were hijacking each other's shipment, machine gunning other rum runners before I went to jail, and it's now organized crime, murdering each other over these stuff. Nothing, not a business for me anymore. And so there's that. As far as the business with the crew, I myself agree with that. As a crew member in a vessel, whether you're carrying passengers or cadets, you're responsible for the safety of those people. And so I myself am a little bit, in fact, some of my public mates thought I was a little puritanical about that. But when I was on watch, if I was going to consume alcohol, it had to be a very moderate amount, a full 8 hours before I was going to be on watch. I did not want I felt it was wrong to stand watch with alcohol significantly in your system. Call me a prude. I don't know. It's just you carry responsibility for safety. So I can understand. It seems a little harsh to dismiss crew members just for possessing alcohol, whether or not they're going to use it or not. But I can understand the logic that goes behind that. Is that crew members, maybe it's not so true for a steward, but if responsible for the working of the vessel, I think you'd be 100% in command of your facilities. And it goes for alcohol and anything else modifying your reaction time and your judgment. So Passengers, hey, let them let them do whatever they want to. And it's really, I took some of the most picturesque examples in my book. There were many, many more that I found of what happened with Prohibition. Um, one of the Cunard liners arrived in Southampton with all of her alcohol stocks completely used up by American passengers.
Wow.
Wanted to drink, and of course they get alcohol once they got to England, but it was just, here we are, boat, hey, the booze, let's drink it. It was one of the first liners back in Britain after the passage of the Volstead Act in the US. And to their shock, they arrived in Southampton with all of their alcohol stocks completely depleted by American bitters. So that's else again was a sad result of prohibition is it created by making something forbidden, it made it far more attractive, and so plenty of people who would have probably only drunk moderately on their trip over to England instead were just taking advantage of every opportunity.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that interesting. I appreciate you bringing it back to class. And then, of course, yeah, the broader political context, but then, about responsibility and maybe a developing idea of what is safe on a ship and whereas in the past it was like, oh, we have to drink to stay awake and to stay warm. Maybe that's shifting by the time that we get to the mid-century. Um, and
Certainly in the mid 20th century, but it's even shifting in the mid 19th century, which is what
right.
leads to grog ration being eliminated in the U.S. Navy, and then um, but then Gustavus Fox is an interesting figure. I've read about him somewhat. Secretary of the Navy in 1914, and he's the one who says that officers can't even buy alcohol and have it in the wardroom. There's going to be no
Right.
booze on U.S. flag naval vessels, effective on a certain date. And apparently, some pretty wild parties where they tried to consume the stocks of alcohol, which the officers had purchased themselves, uh, up to the date when it was forbidden. Um, but yeah, I think it's an interesting subject, and I think it reflects a lot of different sets of considerations when you're looking at
Mhm.
passengers versus under prohibition on at least on American flag vessels. Uh, there's the idea the passengers shouldn't be drinking either. It's where the
Mhm.
temperance movement sort of reaches its zenith, and then but again there are these catastrophic process results of banning alcohol entirely on in the United States, its possessions, and significantly on passenger ships that fly the American flag.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough for joining us tonight. Yeah, as I said, I learned so much, and it was such a pleasure to get to talk to you after reading your book.
Yeah.
And yeah, and understand the context of this fascinating history. I want to give another. Oh, yes.
Well, I wanted to say a last thing is if because the book is the price the book was never cheap and it's gotten more expensive through normal outlets. If anybody cares to buy a used copy, signed and inscribed, please share my email address because what I do is I buy up copies of library discarded. Like this one's still got its library marks on it. I buy up discarded library copies of my book and then I resell them because it's much less expensive to me. My author discount from my publisher is um, not not very attractive. It's more attractive to buy used copies. So anyway, if anyone wants to write me an email address, I can provide a signed inscribed used copy at a very attractive price.
Wonderful. Thank you. I've just put your email in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I'd like to give another thank you to our co-sponsors, the Historic Foodway Society of the Delaware Valley. We encourage you to become a member of the society and connect with others who are passionate about food history. Their website, again, is historicfoodways.org. And a heartfelt thank you to the members who made this program possible. As we enter this new era for the SS United States and the Conservancy, we express our deep appreciation to you and our entire global community of supporters. 2025 will be a big year for us. We'll be releasing our digital exhibit about dining, exploring the topics we discussed tonight and beyond. And we'll also be busy planning and developing a state-of-the-art museum showcasing our collections. Please go to our website to see some of the great renderings done by our board member, David McCauley, incorporating parts of the ship into our land-based museum. And then finally, please consider making a donation, renewing your support, or making a convenient recurrent monthly contribution. Your financial support is indispensable at this turning point. Visit our website at ssusc.org/donate. Thank you and good night. Take care, everybody.